I will not present data or results. I would like just to leave a message to seismic hazard practitioners. Now, let me take this pointer. Okay. Seismic hazard assessment analysis, and especially their products, commonly used in building codes or for insurance purposes, largely depend on either shaking functions and like the GMPs and seismic rates, both local and regional ones. In Mediterranean regions like Italy, Greece, Turkey, but also at the European scale, seismic rate estimates are generally affected by several biases. Firstly, seismic rate estimates are commonly dominated by instrumental and especially historical information that cannot last longer than few decades or few centuries, respectively, in terms of completeness. As a consequence, faults with longer seismic cycles do not and cannot contribute to these estimates. Second bias. Large earthquakes often attract the interest of many researchers, and consequently the literature corresponding to the causative fault becomes rich and abundant in a short time. On the other hand, silent faults and faults associated with minor events are much less investigated, commonly with the consequence that their degree of seismotectonic parameterization is generally poor and scanty. Accordingly, even when seismogenic sources are included in seismic hazard assessment analysis and their seismotectonic parameters are exploited for estimating the seismic rates, the latter are necessarily affected by a similar bias. A further bias is due to the fact that geodynamic rates in the Mediterranean region, along with slip rates of active faults, of course, are commonly low, while recurrence intervals are quite long. It is therefore obvious, though objectively difficult to quantify, that the fault reactivated a few decades or few centuries ago is likely in its initial stage of the new seismic cycle and far from critical conditions for a possible reactivation. If historical information dominates seismic hazard assessment analysis, hazard values for the next 50 years, for example, commonly used in hazard maps, in building codes, are certainly overestimated in areas affected by recently reactivated seismogenic source, and conversely, underestimated in areas with apparently silent faults without any major seismic record during the historical period. I would say that also this trivial observation likely explains the frequent surprises in the occurrence of recent events. An example already shown by Spiro, but I commonly use, in 1990 was published this map solely based on seismological data, both historical and instrumental, and this map could not predict two major events. In particular, the Kozani 1995 events occurred in an area that was characterized as a aseismic, rigid aseismic block. Okay, think about it. This is, I would say, the smoking gun that solely historical, instrumental information is not sufficient. Now, preliminary conclusion from these premises is that seismic hazard assessment analysis need more, and especially complementary, information to fulfill this gap and to reduce this bias. A few years ago, with my friend Bruno Lee, we reappraised the topic and categorized, grouped the most common and most important sources of information commonly used to study past earthquakes and seismogenic sources. You see here a list of. We could say that earthquakes are certainly complex polyhedric phenomena where each facet of the solid represents a distinct source of information, and each source of information should be approached with the proper tools and methods, the proper assumptions, the proper expertise, being aware of the different resolution and the different degree of uncertainty each of these disciplines could provide. For example, instrumental, historical, archaeoseismological approaches, and earthquake geology. Earthquake geology in its broadest sense, earth sciences, if you want. Now, today I will mix up a little bit these sources of information and discuss their use in other terms with a different perspective, with the aim of contributing to the seismic assessment analysis. In particular, I will focus on how earthquake geology, in its broadest sense, again, I mean earth sciences, could improve our knowledge on seismogenic sources, and hence could contribute to better and more realistically estimate the seismic rates used in seismic hazard analysis. So, different sources of information, different approaches, different disciplines, but a common target. That is to say, the recognition of seismogenic sources and their seismotectonic characterization and parameterization. We will see the competition between the different sources of information. These sources of information are commonly organized in databases like this for Italy, GREDES for Greece, EDSF for Europe, and other ones. And they contain as many as possible crucial seismotectonic parameters, geometric ones, kinematic ones, dynamic, chronological ones. So keep in mind this list, because this list is our topic. We have to fill this list of parameters. We have to quantify these parameters. Now, I'll recall you the title of this presentation. And as an exercise, the sources of information have been subdivided into two categories. On one side, those providing information related to a specific earthquake, and on the other side, those providing information on the seismogenic source that caused that earthquake, but also past ones. In other terms, single event effects versus cumulative effects have been independently considered and analyzed. It is useless to stress that while single event effects could be approached and analyzed based on different disciplines, like instrumental seismology, historical seismology, earthquake geology, the analysis of cumulative effects could be based solely on earthquake geology, at least in the Mediterranean region. So the exercise was to consider some major past events, both historical and instrumental ones, and the corresponding causal sources in order to quantify the seismotectonic parameters of these sources, okay? To estimate their degree of uncertainty, we consider a quality index, and thus to populate the database according to single event effects and cumulative effects for the different case studies. Obviously, today there is no time to describe and discuss in detail the specific values attributed to each specific seismotectonic parameters for each specific source, nor to estimate each quality index for each single parameter. There's no time, of course. I will just show you very quickly a few examples of the different sources of information used for analyzing the two types of effects, and thus defining the preferred values for populating this database. The first one is the most recent, the Kozani event. We have, for example, as a source of information, we have macroseismic maps with their orientation along axis. We can get information about the strike default. We can get information from the density, about the depth, the magnitude, and so on. We have at that time we have obviously instrumental information. So we have instrumental epicenter beyond the macroseismic one. We have focal mechanism. We have also ground observations allowing to quantify the displacement, the length of the fault trace. We also have in modeling, better constraining the dimension of the fault, length and width, the distribution of the slip with the maximum slip, the average slip, and so on. In this recent case, we also have dynamic information, nice dynamic information with the distribution of the moment of release on the fault plane, for example. Here we have also geodetic sources of information using, for example, leveling profiles, and with the proper modeling and interpretations, we can get some constraint on the seismotectonic parameters of depth. And in recent times, we have also the new entry of the differential interferometry. And again, here from this information, we can get we can better quantify the seismotectonic parameters, or some of the seismotectonic parameters of the seismogenic source at depth. Next example is the Thessaloniki event. Again, we can have macroseismic fields, getting information, as I told you, about the depth, the magnitude, the macroseismic epicenter. We have also the instrumental epicenter. We have also focal mechanism. We have also the distribution of the seismicity associated to the major event, both areal distribution and at depth distribution. And as Massimiliano has shown very, very nicely, the cutoff of the depth distribution here in section or cumulatively, the cutoff is a nice proxy of the brittle data transition. And with this, we have a good constraint of the down deep dimension of the possible seismogenic sources. So we can constrain some of the tectonic parameters. So also here we have the reconstruction of the slip. So allowing to better constrain the dimension of the fault. We have also mesostructural data or kinematic data independent from ground ruptures, documenting the direction of the stretching direction and the kinematics of the fault. Next, I'm going quickly. We go back in time, 1954. You see, macroseismic field here is a little bit more debated. It's not so clear. It's not unique, but also in this case, we can get anyway some information about the dimension of the fault, the epicenter, macroseismic epicenter. Here we have also in this case a nice, interesting descriptions of field observations, allowing to document the displacement, the fault trace length. And here we have the first, although obtained 20 years later, the first focal mechanism available for, still debated, not well constrained, but some focal mechanisms we can get even 50 years ago, more or less. No much more information for single event effects. The last example is from the Valimitica 1861 event, nice macroseismic field, direction of the long axis of the isoseismals, so some information about the magnitude, the location, and the orientation of the major fault. But we have also nice observation, as Peter's shown, nice observations of the ground rupture, so we can have, we can constrain somehow the displacement, the length of the fault. No much more anyway. It's obvious if we go even back in time, more back in time, the sources of information become poorer. It's obvious. Now, I will compare the same seismogenic sources, the analysis carried out on the same seismogenic sources, analyzing only cumulative effects, assuming that the four events I've shown you before did not occur yet. I mean, the geologist or the earth scientist altogether went there in the field, analyzed data before the event, okay, without considering the event. What kind of information we can get from this kind of analysis and this kind of approach, earthquake geology approach? Again, the first fall, yeah, good geological morphotectonic structural mapping could allow us to map nicely the fault with several segments over steps to characterize whether the segment boundaries are soft segment boundaries or hard segment boundaries. Mesostructural data can provide some information, kinematic information. We can constrain very well the kinematic information, geologically and structurally. Of course, we can carry out paleoseismological trenches, documenting the occurrence of the ultimate, the last, the penultimate, or the third last, and so on, past events. You know, get some information of the slip per event, get some information or some constraint about the recursive interval for this fault. But we can also use macroseismicity. Okay, forget the seismicity, the aftershock related to the main shock. In every region here, there is some sort of background seismicity, macroseismicity, and again, we can use the cutoff depth in order to constrain the brittle data transition. And so to constrain the down deep dimension of the faults. Now, next example is from Mygdonia Basin, good mapping, several branches with steps, with segments and so on, mesostructural data, mesostructural data documenting the kinematics, also in this case, the distribution at depth of the microseismicity, so documenting again the cutoff depth of this, and also, for example, seismological investigations. Okay, this trench shows the last event, but this trench also shows a previous, a penultimate event that could have been documented even before the 1978 Thessaloniki earthquake. We move to the third example. South Karditsa Plain is bounded by a system of faults, clearly highly segmented. Also in this case, geological mapping, morphostructural mapping, morphotectonic and structural mapping could allow to document this, to document also morphometric analysis can contribute to document the location of the segments, so the dimension of the segments, and to see if these segment boundaries are soft or hard, or at least tentatively suggest if these segment boundaries are soft or hard ones. We have also in this case microseismicity distribution of depth, so providing information of depth. We have mesostructural data provided the kinematics, different structural data, slicking lines, slicking planes, and so on. We have paleoseismological trenches. We can do as many as we want, and providing information about the seismic history that affected in recent times that seismogenic source. Move to the last example. In the South Corinth, mapping could show clearly the segmentation, east and west, the leaky fault. We are in the coastal sector, so we can exploit also, based on cumulative effects and earthquake geology approaches, we can also exploit the occurrence of marine terraces. In this case, marine terraces provide uplift rates. Uplift rate can be transformed into throw rates in slip rates. So we can document long-term slip rates of these segments and see their variability, for example. But even in Holocene times, where the coastal sector is rocky, we can have notches and Holocene notches, so we can document also a shorter uplift, throw, and slip rates. Again, we are in a coastal sector, so we can use seismic reflection profiles. Obviously, we could use also on land, but the example here now shows that it is nice. It is obvious, more obvious for offshore areas to use this kind of earth sciences tool. So we can map better the faults, so we can see their distribution of the deformation, the amount of deformation. We can get some together with stratigraphy. We can get also some information about the slip rates, long-term slip rates on these faults. We can also exploit microseismicity distribution, constraining in depth the dimension of the fault. Again, and obviously also paleoseismological investigation can provide information about the cumulative effects of along this seismogenic source. So all this information I've very briefly, shortly and quickly shown you, could help to populate the database separately for the two types. We investigated separately. I will show you the results separately. Okay, here are the numbers. Forget the numbers. Don't look at the numbers, please. Too many. Just look, if you want, at the letters in parentheses corresponding to the quality index. So I made this screening for you, and emphasizing in blue the value among the two approaches, the value which a better rank. Let's say B versus D, C versus C, and so on. Okay. If we consider the most recently reactivated seismogenic sources, let's say this, Aliakmon and Mygdonia, respectively with Kozani and Thessaloniki events, where recent events, so many different sources of information were available and many tools, I would say that if you look at this, I would say the competition is open. Okay. However, if we go back in time, we consider older events. Historical information is getting poorer and instrumental information progressively disappears. Earthquake geology approaches analyzing cumulative effects are clearly more successful and performing. Going farther back in time, it would be even more clear, this disparity. Now, I'm going to conclude, Massimiliano, and I would like to, I told you I didn't want to show you results of data, but just to leave a message. And I would like to emphasize a few points. First, seismic hazard assessment analysis based on seismicity, both instrumental and historical, are certainly biased, at least in the Mediterranean countries. Second, I would suggest a change of paradigm for seismic hazard assessment analysis that should focus more on seismogenic sources and not on past earthquakes, which obviously does not mean that we should neglect the latter, but only we should emphasize the former. Third, and this is an invitation to practitioners of seismic hazard assessment analysis, they should invest more and more on the analysis of cumulative effects based on as many as possible earthquake geology approaches. With geology, I mean earth sciences approaches. Finish saying that I'm sure that if all available sources of information would be properly exploited and historically and geologically based seismic rates would be properly balanced, mixed, the next generation of seismic hazard maps would be more realistic, possibly reducing the seismic surprises and better supporting mitigation policies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.